And good afternoon. My name is Derek Olson. I'm the president of World Oregon, and we're thrilled to have you join us today for our special World Oregon webinar with Rachel Bachman, the senior sports reporter for Wall Street Journal, talking about the Olympics and unpacking the games that just happened in Tokyo. I'll give her an introduction in just a minute, but before we do, just a few reminders and ground rules about World Oregon webinars. Again, these webinars are supported by World Oregon members and sponsors. If you're not already a member, I encourage you to become one. We try to have all of our webinars, as many as possible, free and open to anyone, and your membership help makes that possible. We remind you that the only people with video and audio today will be World Oregon staff and our guest. You can pose your questions in the Q&A function, and you can monitor the chat where my colleague Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs, will post some links and other information about this program and related subjects. So again, please try to post your questions in the Q&A. We're gonna have a robust discussion that Tim's going to be leading, and he'll start working in your questions as soon as you start posting them in the Q&A. Before we jump into today's program, just a reminder, we have a lot of great upcoming programs, starting with tonight, our annual non-governmental organization or NGO showcase that our young professionals host. This is where we have a couple NGOs who talk about their work, and it's really an opportunity for the community to get engaged with this great range of international small nonprofits here in Portland area. That is tonight at 6. Registration is still available, it's free, it's on our website. We'll post the link later in the chat, but again, that's our 9th annual NGO showcase that's hosted by our young professionals. And then some great programs coming up later this month in early November. We have a film and a discussion about the tragic situation in Myanmar, Burma. We have a discussion about the proposed Every Woman Treaty. And we have a discussion with the author of a book about China's diplomats, Peter Martin, that we're doing jointly with the Northwest China Council. Other events coming up, some interesting ones on democratization, on the crisis in Ethiopia. Keep an eye out on worldoregon.org for more details. And now, without further ado, today's event. Again, today's event is entitled Unpacking the Tokyo Olympic Games, a conversation with Rachel Bachman. Again, she's the senior sports reporter of the Wall Street Journal, as you'll see over her shoulder. Got the logo there, very nicely done with a room prep. And we're excited to have her, not only because is she a friend of our director of programs, Tim DeRoche, but she also worked for the Oregonian for years in Portland, covering sports here, and before joining the Wall Street Journal. She grew up in Minneapolis, graduated from the University of Michigan, and we are just honored to have her here. And without further ado, the mic is yours.
Great, and I'm going to jump in a little bit and kick our conversation off. Rachel, glad you could be with us today. It's always good to see your face, as Derek mentioned. We go way back to the olden days when there was still print media everywhere. But so the question about the Olympics, you know, as we were putting together the program, we were thinking about it, you know, in a normal year, in a normal time. The Olympics can be, you know, such an incredible experience. I mean, we all probably have those memories of being kids. And, you know, for me, it was, you know, watching, you know, Nadia Comaneci or the US-Soviet, you know, hockey game. I'm totally dating myself. But those kinds of things. But in a year where we're dealing with a global pandemic and so many challenges globally, it felt like it was a good thing to ask someone who was there, how is this different? How would the games fare? If we read polls, we saw that some close to 80% of Japanese people opposed even hosting the games at all. But I guess the bigger question is, you know, when you think about it, Rachel, what's kind of your immediate big takeaway? What impacted you? What are the memories that sort of come streaming back to you when you think about it?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And there are a whole bunch of them, but as you pointed out, there was considerable debate about whether these games should happen at all, you know, whether it was appropriate in a global pandemic. One of the reasons why Japan was so hesitant to host the games is because of procedural things. very few people relative to the population were vaccinated at the time that the games began. Vaccines were approved quite late in Japan, surprisingly. And, it's an elderly population. So these things combined for, a lot of anxiety about hosting something of this magnitude, which, typically brings about 200,000 people minimum, not even including spectators, just, athletes, coaches, media, et cetera, from all over the world, 200 countries. So that, as we've learned about public health in recent years, that is certainly a recipe for risk in a global pandemic. So a few takeaways from the games. I'll talk about a few specific things that stood out, and maybe if viewers have any follow-ups, I'd be glad to answer them. Japan, this was supposed to be sort of like a recovery games from the Fukushima disaster of years ago, and also a return of the Summer Games to Japan, which last hosted them in 1964, not too many years out of recovery from World War II. So it was symbolic that, for instance, tennis player Naomi Osaka lit the Olympic cauldron, which was seen as sort of an important nod to plurality in Japan. Of course, her father is Haitian, her mother is Japanese. Simone Biles, the American gymnast, stepping back from competition for a while for her mental and physical health. That was certainly unprecedented for a star to do in Olympic history. Because there were no spectators allowed, it didn't really feel like the Olympics. This is my 6th Olympic Games I've covered, including summer and winter games. And it was just, frankly, bizarre to go to, for instance, the Olympic Stadium and to have almost every seat empty except for maybe a few dozen athletes who are waiting for their events to start, or their events are coming up the next day, or soccer stadiums empty, swimming, on and on and on. Just on the sporting field, the US women performed very well. They won about 58% of Team USA's medals. And as a result, about 57% of the primetime coverage on NBC was of female athletes. And if you follow sports, this is highly unusual. Almost all the sports coverage, or much of the sports coverage on broadcast television, centers on male sporting events. So that was really significant, and it actually continued a trend of other recent Olympics, because US women have performed well in recent Olympics. And the Olympics have added more events for women. So the US has certainly benefited from that. And if if anyone has questions about COVID protocols, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about those. They were a little strange, a little bit retro, but I'll throw it back to you, Tim, so you can maybe get into a few more specifics.
Well, I guess the COVID question certainly comes up. You were talking about 11,000 athletes and several thousand foreign journalists coming in. Did you get the feeling as a group that you were somehow, were you the invading hordes? Were you threatening the country? What was the feeling for the media pool and just the the Olympic bubble?
Yeah, well, there was a real irony to that, because as I mentioned, many Japanese were not vaccinated, and I think for certainly most of the big delegations, Olympic delegations, a large majority of their delegations were vaccinated, and probably, a large majority of media were too. So it's kind of strange that we were seen as sort of the invading hordes, even though we were much more likely to be vaccinated than locals, just because of the way things worked out. I mentioned the protocols were somewhat retro. They had, plexiglass dividers in eating areas, as if that would sort of help mitigate the spread of disease, when we, at least in the US, had really concluded that those were not helpful. There was hand sanitizer absolutely everywhere, which, it's not bad to have clean hands, of course, but it's probably not going to stop transmission of, the most contagious variants of COVID. So, things like that were strange. And there was also a feeling that, we were certainly isolated as the visiting people, like in the Olympic Village for the athletes, or in our hotels for media, and basically prohibited from going anywhere other than there or Olympic venues. Whereas, for instance, the Japanese volunteers who were helping out at the games could go anywhere. They could go home, go on the subway, go to restaurants, go to grocery stores, and then come back to the Olympic venues. So it was a little bit of well, it was a very porous Olympic bubble, even though there was also a lot of testing and so on. But it made for kind of a bizarre approach to try to mitigate spread of COVID.
So you and I were speaking a while back about this in terms of teams being vaccinated, and they weren't requiring vaccination. And you made a comment at the time about they didn't want it to, because many of these countries are, smaller GDP or developing countries. They didn't want it to be the rich country Olympics. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, and that's the number one question I got. People were just aghast that the International Olympic Committee or local organizers didn't require vaccination. And that was exactly the reason why. They really hesitated to put people in a situation where, for instance, a number of African countries or South American countries where the vaccine was not widely available last summer or even last spring when some athletes would have needed to receive it. They didn't want, Olympic organizers didn't want to seem like they were excluding those groups. And, even efforts to donate vaccines didn't completely pan out because as the IOC did, they said, we're going to volunteer to donate vaccines to people who need them. But at the time they did that, we checked and there were still about 100 countries around the world that had not yet approved that vaccine. And so it was just, because of the timing of the pandemic and because of, the global wealth gap, it was just kind of a non-starter. Olympic organizers felt to require vaccines, even though it certainly would have made the Olympics safer, you could argue.
So with this year's games, just to kind of take a side track, there were some new sports this year, and I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of some of the new entries, but also kind of what were surprises for you in terms of which countries or which sports kind of came to the surface.
Yeah, well, surfing was new, and I think that one is going to especially take off at the LA 28 Olympics, which is sort of like one of the global homes of surfing. Rock climbing, sort of a super fast version of rock climbing, was very popular, and I think an interesting way to kind of present something that's gradually gained momentum globally. Of course, skateboarding, another quintessentially American sport. That was popular on TV as well. And these are all, of course, efforts by the International Olympic Committee to attract younger viewers, because like all giant events, they're trying to get to reach younger viewers, to grow their audience. And that's a challenge when you have some events that are maybe not terribly common or not terribly popular to a global audience, like maybe equestrian or there's dozens of Olympic sports, so the summer games are really quite sprawling. So I thought that was a good effort to kind of like mix some new blood into things and some really young athletes as well.
So are we going to see esports in the Olympics? Are we going to watch people gaming in the future, do you think?
I wouldn't rule it out. And the only thing that IOC officials have said is they will not allow war games. So shooting games, games that involve some kind of violence, they won't allow. But I think, that leaves a lot of possibilities on the table. And given just the global popularity of gaming, it's hard to, I would never say never. I think it's certainly a possibility.
So one of the things we talked about a while back was we all see the NBC version of the Olympics, and you are seeing a very, very different version of this oftentimes. What are you seeing that we're not seeing? And how you mentioned surfing, for instance. How do you do something like surfing, which is clearly the wave is not going to conform to NBC's broadcast schedule?
Right. Well, surfing is a particularly difficult thing, and sailing to some extent too, because you're somewhat reliant on the wind. There has to be some wind, right? But yeah, in that case, my understanding is there was sort of like a range of dates that the competition could have taken place, and I don't know what they would do if they reached the end of that range and there were no good waves in that time. I guess they have to determine that, but that's why there's been some discussion about having wave pools for surfing competitions, because then you don't have to rely on the surf. So, and I'm sorry, what was the question?
What are you seeing that we're not seeing?
Right. Well, that's hard. It's a little hard to answer because I almost never see the NBC broadcast, like any portion of it. And so it's even hard to say what, so I don't know what I missed, in other words. But I mean, generally speaking, if in Japan, for instance, when I turned on the Japanese broadcast, some nights it was simply just jumping from sport to sport, even for, in segments of 2 minutes. And they were just simply following Japanese athletes. Like, so you'd be, here you're at Taekwondo, and then you're at table tennis, and then you're at women's gymnastics, and then you're at men's gymnastics. And I mean, it's just like this, sort of herky jerky jumping from here to there. And I think, in a more sort of like fluid form, that's probably partly what NBC does, because we see mostly American athletes traditionally. But so it's a little bit hard to answer that question. I know that NBC covered the marathon because there was the one time I got part of the NBC feed at the media center in Tokyo, and that was sort of interesting because there were Americans in contention. But it is sort of interesting to see the differences. I mean, every country is obsessed with its own athletes, and that's definitely true from games to games.
Well, so that's an interesting question in terms of thinking about sports that might be big in other countries. In the music biz, we always talk about, the bands that are proverbially big in Japan.
Yeah.
But so I don't know, badminton or, what are some of the games that maybe you've learned about that you would never have known a thing about?
Well, this is perhaps not surprising, but one of the evolutions of the Olympics is flexibility. So now a lot of people don't realize this, but hosts of the Olympics can add their own events. So there's flexibility, or drop them, for instance. So for instance, in Japan, people love baseball and softball. And so those events were added for these games. They've been dropped in the past. But most likely they'll be dropped for the Paris 2024 games. Karate was added for Japan because it's very popular, and those were very well attended. Well, I should say very well attended. There's a lot of attention on them. They would have been well attended. Were there any spectators there? But because, the host country anticipated winning medals in karate, and the host country anticipated that those would be popular spectator events. So that's definitely a big departure from Olympics past. But, table tennis, I think, I'm not even sure how much it was shown on NBC, but table tennis is absolutely fascinating to watch. I didn't see it live, but we were able to watch feeds from the media center, which, by the way, is the most incredible sports bar in the world. It has, ad-free feeds from basically any event that's going on at the Olympics that moment, at screens all over the media center. And so it's, so people can track things even if they're not there in person. And, just the intensity in the expressions and the postures of people playing table tennis. I mean, I would watch like a whole, table tennis World Series if maybe something like that exists. That was just riveting, and it's something that U.S. historically is not very good at. So I'm guessing NBC didn't show very much of it. But I'm guessing in China it was prime time, or at least got a lot of airtime at some point.
That brings up the question of sort of media and internet. It's so much easier to find kind of niche communities and subcultures for people, and I'm wondering if sort of how globalism is changing, quote unquote, the game for your field and what people write about. And do you think audiences, and in particular American audiences, are becoming more attuned to things outside of, the meat and potatoes of baseball, football, basketball?
Absolutely. And you see this with the growth and interest in the Premier League, the English Premier League soccer in the US. Now that it's televised globally, people can watch it, people can follow it. And that's one of the reasons why it's become such an enormously rich league, because people can watch it anywhere in the world. But by the same token, what's really exploded in sports is streaming audiences. So apps, everything from Paramount Plus, Peacock, you name it. There's tons of them. You can follow like the Women's Super League in England now, which is the women's soccer league, or basketball, or almost any sport you can think of. There's some streaming platform now, and I think providers are realizing that you don't have to have a gigantic audience. If you have a really devoted, interested audience that will pay $8 or $10 a month or whatever, and you can find a few 100,000 of those people around the globe, that's a serious business. And then once the league grows, you've got this endemic audience, and that's where I think a lot of the growth will come, just in eyeballs, because it's much more accessible, and people can access, can tune in anywhere in the world. They don't have to wait for a broadcast. And I think people are being more, media companies are being more responsive to that, to finding audiences that aren't necessarily just the gigantic NFL audiences.
So you referenced the the media center at the Olympics, which I imagine it's like it's the press room. But I'm curious, does geopolitics play out at all in terms of who has access, what's getting reported? I mean, is the media pool from Kyrgyzstan given the same access and advantages that, say, a US or a German team might have?
I would say it's sort of a sliding scale. And I think the IOC does make a lot of effort to be inclusive in this manner, because it wants to get its message around the globe, which is, sport as a force for good. So you will see people from everywhere around the world at the media center. And they do credential reporters from everywhere. Generally speaking, if there's, like, for instance, that there's an event that, say a basketball final, like the US men played France. So if you're from the French media, my understanding is you would get some consideration in terms of getting access to that game, if there is limited access, as there sometimes is at high demand events. So if you're already credentialed to cover the Olympics, you can say, hey, I'm from French media and France is playing in this very important game, and so I should have access. And that will usually get you, a better chance of getting in. In this case, I think there probably were a few less reporters than there typically are covering the games because of COVID and so on. And so my sense is there probably weren't many events that people couldn't get in, reporters couldn't get into if they wanted to. But it's complicated because of course they sell the broadcast rights to different countries. NBC owns the US rights, and then the German rights and the Argentine rights and so on are sold separately. And so there's a whole hierarchy of sort of access to, TV interviews and so on. So that gets a little more complicated, but, sort of garden variety reporters like us, you can generally access things that you want to, particularly ones that involve the nation that you come from.
So you mentioned sport as a force for good. There were certainly some stories that I think that came out of the Olympics. The Qatar and Italian high jump was one. We saw record numbers of openly LGBTQ athletes competing. What were some of the sort of sport for good stories that really resonated with you? And then maybe we could turn our focus to, what's the good, the bad, and the ugly too.
Well, you mentioned a few. I think. It was good to hear people talking about the importance of vaccination and, sort of caring about keeping healthy, things like that. Representation. It's funny, you mentioned LGBTQ athletes, and maybe it's because I cover women's soccer, and this is that, like the US women and the National Women's Soccer League, which is the pro league in the US, I think are really far ahead in this way. So, it doesn't seem that unusual to me anymore for athletes to be out, but I guess it sort of is. As we know from news of this, recent months, the NFL has its first openly gay player, and so this is still pretty unusual in men's sports. So just more openness is good, I think. So I think that's probably the best thing, I would say.
Well, and I think one of the big stories that came out of this was the question of the mental health of athletes, certainly around Simone Biles. So, do you think that international sport is now, understanding or getting a grip and looking at the importance of the mental health of athletes, or do you think that this is still a real uphill battle?
I think it's in flux. I think it depends sometimes on the sport. But I've been really heartened. the NBA player Kevin Love in recent years has spoken about his mental health struggles and anxiety. And even at the Tokyo Olympics, Caleb Dressel is the superstar American swimmer who is really kind of almost like shouldered with the burden of filling the shoes of Michael Phelps, who's, he has impossible shoes to fill essentially. And, Caleb Dressel really, he won 5 gold medals, but after winning his first individual gold, he broke down in tears. And he talked about, self-doubt and all these expectations he was shouldering. And he said, the sport was a lot more fun when no one knew my name. And I just don't think you would have heard someone, especially male athletes, say that even 5 years ago. It just was sort of taboo. He might have been emotional, but he probably would not have explained why he was emotional and, revealed that vulnerable side. And so I think that's really heartening because, there has been a lot of damage from sport, from, people internalizing their anxiety and, or shouldering huge expectations, or in some cases, coach abuse and so on, and, not seeking help. And so it's great modeling behavior for someone who is as accomplished as Caleb Dressel. Hey, I have 5 gold medals, and this was still a really intimidating experience and, exhausting, and maybe even, dare he say, not as fun as he thought it would be. Even though it was fun, it was an ordeal, and I think it's just healthy to have those open conversations in a way that didn't used to happen.
There was a lot of discussion about the role of politics and protest at the games. And is it reasonable at this point in time to think that you cannot somehow bring the social dimension of that into the games?
Well, that's a great question. And in fact, it ended up being really not a big story because hardly anybody protested really. And in fact, we ran a story saying that the few athletes who did sort of offer some semi-political gesture were Chinese, and they didn't really draw a lot of attention in the US. But there was controversy going into it because the IOC had basically said no political protests of any kind, essentially do that on your own time, certainly not on a podium, if you've won a medal. But the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee coming in had said, look, we're not going to punish anybody who protests. So it sort of set up this potential conflict between the International Olympic Committee and the USOPC about, what would happen if there were, a really, a protest that absolutely violated IOC rules, but that the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee was not going to punish, and that really didn't happen.
Well, and I mean, the IOC is not an organization that is immune to accusations and criticisms about politics. So I'm curious, especially in your field with other writers, what is the feeling about the politics around the IOC? I mean, I think of the IOC and FIFA, for instance, as 2 organizations that have been really under the microscope over the last few years. And what do you think? How is this going to affect the future of the Olympics?
You mean the political sort of like the, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think the thing that people sort of cite in terms of, the IOC wanting to stay out of things is that, it's impossible to be completely apolitical. The last Winter Olympics were in Pyeongchang, South Korea, and there were North Koreans there. And Thomas Bach, the president of the IOC, sort of made a big show of wanting to bring North and South Korea together, which, I would argue is inherently very political. But, no matter what you think of it, it's a very political gesture by a sporting official. And so to say, in other circumstances, oh, we don't want any politics in our Olympics is a little, some people would say kind of disingenuous, because there are instances where the IOC has injected politics, and going back, aside from the IOC, I mean, certainly in 1980, the US and dozens of other countries boycotted the Moscow Olympics, the Summer Games, during when, that Russia was known as the Soviet Union. And that was certainly very political and very controversial. So the Olympics very often have been, the epicenter of political discussion. And so it's although it can be, I'm sure, difficult for people who organize, there's no question that politics are going to intersect with the games. It's just a matter of when and how.
Well, to that point, I've got a great question from your former colleague, Mike Francis, who is in the audience today. Do you have any observations about the Belarus sprinters defection, and specifically the avenue of the games for defection generally?
Well, that's a good question, because this is another instance where the games become inherently political, because the organizers and the IOC have this question: okay, what do we do with this person who wants to defect? And I think, for good reason, and I would support it. In this case, the IOC said, we will protect you and try to get you to safety. And there have been there have been many, Cuban athletes and athletes from other countries who have defected. And I think particularly when people express concern for their safety, or, express that they're severely impoverished or some other extreme condition, of course, it's just a humanitarian gesture to try to help them out how you can. And I think it would be disingenuous for the IOC to want to, use athletes as part of their, sort of message that sport is for good and sport is for peace and for everybody, and then turn their backs on athletes who needed help. And so I think that, what happened with that athlete is what should happen, which is some protection, and the IOC and others doing whatever they can to protect people and not return them to what might be a dangerous situation.
Well, what's your thought on, sort of more authoritarian states getting into the game of wanting to host the Olympics? In many ways, it can be seen cynically as a bit of a PR campaign. Absolutely.
And certainly this is the main controversy with the Beijing Winter Olympics, which start in about 4 months, believe it or not. The notion of the Olympics as sort of a giant trumpet of this country's ideals and accomplishments to the world is certainly a thing. And there are many people who are upset that the Olympics are going back to China, because the message from 2008, the last time that China hosted the Olympics, then that time the Summer Games, was, okay, we're awarding you these games with the hope that you will become a more open and democratic society. And I think many people would argue that that didn't happen. So, the fact that the games are going back in spite of that, and with, controversy about, human rights abuses and so on, has only increased the criticism on the IOC, which, continues to defend itself by saying, we're non-political, we're not getting into the way people run their countries, we're only overseeing the games themselves and whether they are run to our specifications. But it's I have no doubt that Russia has interest in hosting future Olympics, and aside from autocratic countries, I think for instance, I know India really wants to host a Summer Olympics, and it would be hugely important for that nation to be able to host a truly, the biggest sporting event in the world, for just its sort of like international, messaging, and sort of for its own kind of, arrival on the world stage. And so, it doesn't have to be something that's hugely controversial, but the Olympics are still attractive to many countries to host, because they still are seen as a huge platform and kind of a jewel in the crown.
Well, so it's interesting looking at what happened in Tokyo. I mean, at the end of the games, Tokyo was essentially left with a $15 billion bill, which was double what was expected. So did Japan feel in the end it was worth it to host the Olympics and Paralympics with no spectators, or was this just a major headache and a boondoggle?
I think it was some combination thereof. You have to remember that the context is Japan is a very wealthy country. And so when you compare those numbers, I mean, yes, it's a lot of money, but it's not like it's different to have cost overruns in a country like Japan than in, for instance, Brazil, whose economy was already declining pretty precipitously before it hosted the 2016 Summer Games. And so, Japan's going to be fine financially. The Olympics won't bankrupt it. Athens 2004, that country arguably was very harmed financially by hosting the Olympics because of the cost overruns. And so that was a different story. But, I think for Japan, it was sort of a probably kind of a letdown, or maybe a big letdown. It just did not feel like the Olympics. There weren't, as I mentioned, there were no spectators. There was just very little buzz around town because you just couldn't, you really couldn't go many places. We had essentially a 2-week quarantine, people who were visiting, meaning you could only go from Olympic venues to your hotel. So there wasn't, there was very little tourism and very little interaction with the public. And I think the public responded by sort of shrugging and not getting very excited. And, just to contrast, London 2012, I mean, despite the British public being somewhat skeptical of all this, rah-rahs going into it, it just absolutely fell in love with the games. And people turned out by the millions in public squares to watch parties. They sold out every ticket. The London Games were so popular, they sold out a lot of the Paralympic events a few weeks later because people just could not get into the Olympic events. And so it was just, the contrast could not have been greater with another great world city, Tokyo, which just, approached these games with dread. And then the locals really were not able to enjoy them. So that was, those two things combined for really kind of a big bummer of an Olympics.
So it was Geraldo opening up Al Capone's vault all over.
A little bit, with the one caveat that, I'm sure people still watch some things on television and, were inspired by, for instance, Japan, I believe, set a record for its medal count. So people certainly, were happy about that, but there was no sort of like public rallying point or, kind of groundswell or buzz like there are in most other Olympic cities. And that's really what's missing from Tokyo.
Well, you mentioned earlier the Japan is an increasingly aging society. So I'm curious, with the coverage of the games and the sort of reception, was there a big generational shift in terms of, or generational split in terms of who was excited or who watched them? I mean, did young people just write it off?
Tim, it's really hard to tell because there just really was almost no buzz around town. And really, I mean, people there, it's strange to say, like I said, the locals could sort of circulate as they wanted, but we were really segregated from the public. And so it was very hard to tell sort of how they were reacting to things. And so I imagine it really depended on the person. Like if you came into these games, into the Olympics, you probably got pretty interested in them. And if you weren't, they weren't really creating a lot of Olympics fans because you couldn't enjoy them in person. And that's really the huge difference from previous games. And, previous games, we'll talk about these incredible legacies and people from London who were able to go in person. And then I got so excited, I decided to volunteer for the next Olympics and, go to the next. I mean, it just creates this, people who have like a great in-person Olympic experience, it can create like a lifelong Olympic fan. And it just didn't happen in Tokyo.
So in terms of site selection, we've got a question from one of the attendees. Are there enough destinations that can afford to host the Olympics in light of the ballooning costs and the debt to do so?
That's a good question. Surprisingly, there is a number of countries. There are a number of countries that are lined up to host the games. And they have their own reasons. It depends on the place. I think Russia still, really does like the celebration and kind of the global platform of, here we are, the center of the world. China certainly. Salt Lake City is bidding to host a future Winter Olympics again. So, that's another one. I know Germany has talked about it. So believe it or not, there are countries lining up. At the same time, the IOC has really placed an emphasis on, and this is really after Tokyo was awarded as a site, which happened in 2013. After that, the IOC really emphasized reusing facilities. And so then, that produced the LA 28 successful bid, in which essentially they're going to build hardly anything because it's Los Angeles. They already have everything. They have this new NFL stadium, which will be the Olympic Stadium, which is SoFi. And they have, all these colleges, universities that have facilities. And so they really have to build hardly anything, which is great because, that's the way they should be, right? Other countries, obviously India would have to build quite a bit. Brisbane, Australia was just awarded the 2032 Summer Games. It's not clear to me, they'll probably have to build some things, how many, I don't know, but believe it or not, people, even despite these massive cost overruns, people still want to host the games. In some cases, maybe it's because of the cost overruns, because they might, local municipalities might get a new train or a new road system or, things like that, which is part of the controversy, but believe it or not, there are people lined up to host the games despite their cost.
So this is Derek jumping in. Looks like
Okay.
maybe we had Tim had internet challenges.
Oh no.
So I'm gonna jump back in, and just continuing on with some of that. Have you covered the World Cup? I mean, do you see parallels there? Is one more performing than the other, or just as challenges? Of course, there's been a lot of controversy about the World Cup, as Tim mentioned, with FIFA and everything.
Right. I have not covered the Men's World Cup. I did cover the 2019 Women's World Cup, which, by the way, I highly recommend if you ever get the chance to go, because it's a global event that's still pretty accessible and affordable, but it is very exciting and fun. But that is the challenge of these global events. They're very expensive to put on. There's a lot of politics involved in landing the bid, and so, there's certainly controversy about the 2022 Men's World Cup in Qatar, and the massive building going on there to prepare for it. So this is an ongoing issue, and I think it's always going to be an issue as long as these things are so expensive, and there are geopolitical debates about whether we should go to this country or that country. So that's pretty much a constant, I think.
Right, and you're totally right about. I had the opportunity to see a Women's World Cup game a couple years back when Canada hosted a game in Montreal, because I was in the Northeast and was able to go up and visit, and it was an incredible experience. And and as you know here, the Thorns are very strongly supported, and I think if it were not for the fact that usually the World Cups want larger venues, you would see a men's or women's World Cup being hosted here, but they usually go to the cities with the larger venues, since Providence Park only, has in the low 20,000s, and they won't host one there usually. Plus, it's turf. So
yeah, right. Although 2026, the Men's World Cup is coming to the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
Right.
And I would be surprised if the U.S. didn't bid on a future Women's World Cup too. The next one that's available, I believe, would be 2027. The 2023 version is going to be in Australia, New Zealand. So I wouldn't be surprised if the US hosted in 2027 or the following one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I'm pretty sure that the Men's World Cup, hey, there's Tim, the vagaries of the internet these days, that Seattle will probably host, since they have a larger venue in grass. Although I got to say, having played soccer in the Northwest, a very well-maintained artificial turf can often be in better shape than a worn-out grass field after months of people playing it on with the mud, as anybody who's been to a youth soccer game can attest. And so, and the Providence Park turf is, top of the line. So I always find that somewhat humorous when that becomes a controversy, given the state of some of the grass fields that are out there. But anyways.
True. Although for FIFA, that's a rule. So
yeah,
the Men's World Cup and
right.
more recently the Women's World Cup, you have to have all matches on grass.
And I get that, but I think it's based on back in the day. I mean, as someone who grew up playing grass, it's wonderful, but if the grass field is not well maintained, it is not necessarily better. So I think that's a rule that dates from when you had the terrible AstroTurf and perfect grass. So Tim, I'm going to pass the.
Yeah, sorry for that. This could be a nice segue into a little PSA for the Oregon grass seed export business, because Oregon grass seed provided the fields for the the last couple World Cups, and was used for flood abatement in the Beijing Olympics. So
wow, I did not know that. And
yeah,
when I was at the Oregonian, one of the things I covered was college football, and I thought it was so weird that there we were in the middle of like the grass seed capital of the world, and University of Oregon and Oregon State both had artificial turf fields, and that struck me as so strange and like a marketing opportunity lost.
Sure. I'm not sure what you were able to ask when I went dark, but
You're chatting just a little bit about soccer and FIFA compared to the Olympics, and
right.
a little bit about that. And so I'll hand it back to you.
Sure. I mean, we were talking about where people were hosting, where site selection, but I'm wondering what you think about the idea of having a permanent host site for the Olympics rather than continually rotating and having to constantly build venues. I mean, could this be a reality, or would this also be a very fraught with politics decision?
Well, a little both. I think it's more practical, without a doubt. The downside is, of course, then some countries are constant visitors. They never get to host, and some would be coming from a very long way away all the time. So that's that's sort of the pro and con. I think there might be a compromise. So picking like two to four permanent summer sites and 2 to 4 permanent winter sites would allow it to move around somewhat. So from different, from continent to continent, but not require this huge churn of building things. I mean, a bobsled track is just one of the most expensive things on earth, and you just do not use them very often unless you're in Austria or Germany. You're just not going to get used much. And so that's a perfect example of something we should have a permanent site for.
Well, I mean, that also brings up the question. I'm sure it is being discussed in circles, but what role is climate change playing with the future projection for Olympics?
Well, it's already, I think, knocked out a few previous sites. I mean, for instance, when I covered the 2010 Vancouver Games, the snowboard venue was at a lower elevation site than the alpine skiing venue, and there was hardly any snow. I mean, it was melting constantly. It was unseasonably warm that year, 2010. And so they were actually dropping like box cars of homemade snow onto the field, onto the slope. So it was a complete mess. And so I don't think they would want to go back there with the risk of that happening again. Am I losing you, Tim?
All righty. Well, we're going to play rotating conversationalist. Audience, keep those questions coming as the internet seems to be acting up today. No, it's an interesting comments you made about that, because I have heard a lot of discussion about the pros and cons of rotating both for the Olympics and other large events. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the World Cup, but I mean, have you been to other types of, I mean, how do you see an international one as compared to like a domestic, Super Bowl or the NBA playoffs or something like that? I mean, if it's done right, does it really get more of that global, like you said, that people who get the Olympics bug then, or is it just, is a lot of that just sort of a hoopla?
No, I think the Olympics really are quite magical when there is some sort of like opportunity to mix with people and so on. And I'll give you an example. So, and this is something that's not really possible in the era of COVID. But when I was at the Vancouver Games, one of the customs for athletes is actually to sell their gear when they leave. Which sounds kind of funny, but for some athletes it's actually welcome cash, and other ones it's just sort of like a fun thing they can do. So I was in Vancouver and I saw these really cool Swedish like pull-ups, and I was like, I really want to buy one of those. So I walked up to a guy downtown Vancouver and said, hey, where can I buy one of those? And he said, oh, well, this is team issued, so I don't think they sell them anymore. He said, but I'll sell it to you. So he sold, he said, we agree to this transaction, and I go to an ATM and get, 60, I think it was 60 Canadian dollars for this very nice hoodie, zip up. And then I just said, okay, so team issued, where are you from? He's like, I'm from Sweden. And he tells me his name. And I realized he's won 2 gold medals at those games. And now I have his hoodie. I still own it. It's up in my closet. And, things like that just, of course, couldn't happen in Tokyo. We were having no interaction with athletes that wasn't, this very regimented, distanced interview sessions. And so, that's an example of these like sort of magical moments that can happen when the Olympics are wide open and people can sort of mix with each other, and particularly the winter games, which are much smaller in scale than the summer games.
Yeah. I mean, Tim might have mentioned earlier, we had Tom Goldman from NPR speak before the Olympics when it was unclear what was going to happen, and he mentioned a few moments along those that really I think had stuck with him and do seem to be more unique than, say, a Super Bowl or World Series or something, as far as that type of a moment.
Yes, definitely. That does make for a more unique experience. I think you're on mute now, Tim.
Boy, I'm just a mess today.
We are all of you. Okay, this is a era we live in.
There.
Let's circle back to Oregon, and let's play a little bit with putting the Olympics into a frame. I think one of the stories that came out with the Olympics was the question of the sexism that is really built into the uniforms that women are wearing. And this question of sexism in professional sports, which we have seen unfold in our own backyard with the Thorns lately. And I'm wondering if you can talk about, how do we move beyond what clearly is very much still an old boy situation for a lot of women athletes? Well,
it's an interesting dichotomy because, as I mentioned, 57% of NBC's primetime coverage was women. So, in that respect, women have arrived. At the very tops of sports federations, the leadership is almost always male at this point. And that's true globally. The International Olympic Committee has never had a female president that I know of. And, same is true for these, many of the big federations, certainly FIFA and, basketball and on. And so, I think the IOC is making efforts and global sport is making efforts to be more gender inclusive, but the decision makers at the top are still mostly men. And so you get things like, men deciding on uniforms that women don't want to wear because they're too skimpy or whatever. We have a much graver situation with the Portland Thorns where, of course, there was a coach there about 5 years ago who it came out recently in a excellent story in The Athletic, had committed various degrees of sexual misconduct with players. And that essentially the Thorns separated from him, but didn't sound the alarm of concern about some of these allegations in a way that prevented him from coaching elsewhere. And in fact, he did coach elsewhere and ended up coaching with the North Carolina Courage before he was fired recently after the story came out. So, in the case of the NWSL, still most of the ownership is male, and most of the systems, and many of them are absolutely crucial to the running of this. I mean, I just wrote a story about Thorns owner Merritt Paulson, who arguably might have done more for women's soccer than most people around the world, because he launched what I would argue is the most successful women's professional franchise in history. The Thorns pre-pandemic were averaging 20,000 a game, and we're given equal billing outside the stadium with the men's team, the Timbers. And so, this owner has done huge amounts for women's soccer. At the same time, there are, systems that, such as the very low salaries of the NWSL, and, players have very few rights right now. They actually don't even have a collective bargaining agreement. So that's a very vulnerable position from which to operate and try to ask for change or sound the alarm about treatment when you are barely making a living doing this, or really have no rights if your team cuts you. So that's kind of the dilemma that the National Women's Soccer League is in now, and to some extent other women's sports, because they tend to be fairly young leagues. And as we know from the NBA and many other men's sports leagues, it can take decades to really establish yourself as a league. And the NWSL is only 9 years old. So it's very young in sporting leagues context, and it has a lot of growing pains right now. But I think it is going to change because players are speaking out and using the recognition and fame that they have to speak out and demand change.
So do you miss covering UP and Portland soccer?
I actually didn't cover much UP, but I was very excited to cover a few Portland women's soccer games because, I mean, those teams were star-studded. I mean, Christine Sinclair was on the gold medal winning Canadian soccer team at the Olympics. Megan Rapinoe, of course, needs no introduction. She also played at UP. And I still follow, certainly the Blazers, who I covered briefly, and Oregon and Oregon State teams, which have been varying degrees of scrappy to excellent. So I definitely follow with interest from afar.
So the other Oregon related story is Sha'Carri Richardson. So Sha'Carri Richardson, as anyone who has followed the news knows, was banned for a positive test revealed cannabis use. What was the international reaction amongst your sports reporting colleagues? And as a former Oregonian, where in fact, as we all know, cannabis is legal, what's your take on this, especially as so much of the demonization around cannabis is being lessened?
Well, interestingly, internationally, like the international track community was were head scratching that this was so controversial, because they felt like, oh, well, cannabis is on the banned list and she tested positive for it, so of course she's going to be suspended and not go to the Olympics. But in the US, where these laws are evolving very quickly, and we just have a different, we're more freedom-minded, more independent, I don't know, but the US was, almost universally outraged, I think, that the overnight superstar sprinter of the American team would be precluded from competing in the games because she tested positive for marijuana, which is legal in the state of Oregon, in all uses. And so I think that was one of the ironies that people were so outraged about, that how can this be on the banned list if it's actually legal in the state where the trials took place. They were in Eugene, but of course the ban list has been in existence for quite a while. And in fact, in the wake of this controversy, the World Anti-Doping Agency said it's looking into the possibility of removing cannabis from the banned list. So I think that is a good thing that came out of this. At a minimum, it should have to justify why it's on there, right? Because it doesn't make much sense to have it on there if it isn't in fact provably performance enhancing.
Right. So the question is, are you planning to cover the next Olympics?
Oh, yes. I will be, knock on wood, I will hopefully go to Beijing, and where we expect the bubble to be even tighter than in Tokyo. We expect no end of the quarantine. We will be, holed up in our hotel and the venues and nowhere else for the duration. And then we'll go directly to the airport and come home. And I suspect that even if there's not a vaccine mandate, effectively people will probably not go if they're not vaccinated, because it's not clear what being in quarantine in China would look like, but I don't really want to find out. So we're certainly we've already been vaccinated, and we will hope to escape infection. And in fact, the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee this time has required vaccination. And I think they're anticipating the same thing, that there's just too many unknowns if people test positive, and they want to avoid that at all costs.
Sure. Well, we are coming up on our hour. Rachel, really great to see you. It's always nice to see your friendly face again. Thanks for your thoughts, your perspective. My apologies for everyone on the technical glitches, but this is the world we live in, and sometimes it happens. And for folks who want to follow her, she is at the Wall Street Journal. And, we're, of course, very proud of you being a former Oregonian, that you took off to the big city and you're still doing what you're doing. And thanks a lot. We will be posting this up on YouTube after the event. And we will hopefully see you again sometime soon. Everyone be safe out there, and tune in this evening for the NGO Showcase and all the other wonderful programs that Derek mentioned coming up. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Tim. Take care.